Over January 2026, the attention on Russia's war against Ukraine has mostly focused on the dire energy crisis inside Ukrainian cities. But here, along the front line, especially in eastern Ukraine, the battles have been going on with just as much intensity as ever. To understand what the situation is around the area of Pokrovsk in Donetsk Oblast, consistently one of the hottest areas of the front line, we spoke today to Volodymyr Polevyi, the spokesperson for the 7th Corps of Ukraine's Air Assault Forces. Volodymyr, thank you for taking time to speak to the Kyiv Independent today. I know the situation in Pokrovsk is very intense, but the front line has kind of gone out of the headlines a bit because of the ongoing energy crisis, let alone events in the world. So can you bring us up to date a little bit about where we stand right now in Pokrovsk and the area around? What's the situation?
The situation indeed remains complicated. The enemy continues its creeping advance. This also concerns Pokrovsk. Unfortunately, the enemy was able to secure the high ground in Pokrovsk. The city itself is located on elevated terrain. As a result, the enemy began to control more territory. They were able to deploy their repeaters and electronic warfare systems. They conduct surveillance from Pokrovsk. They have brought their drone teams to Pokrovsk. This allows them to extend their kill zone deeper into our territory. That's why our logistics north of Pokrovsk is becoming more and more complicated, more and more difficult. The enemy took full advantage of this. They have accumulated forces in Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad, and recently, taking advantage of bad weather in Ukraine, they have been trying to push further in all directions, looking for our weak spots. So we see that the number of assaults is increasing. In some areas, the enemy is trying to dig in and push further.
Many people are interested in the status of control over Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad. Sometimes this question seems to carry more political weight than real significance. But what can you say about the current control situation? What percentage of Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad is under our control?
The northern parts of these cities, those located north of the railway, which runs through the cities from west to east, are partially under our control. So, in total, from 10 to 20% of these cities are under our control now. Moreover, it should be understood that this is not a continuous front line, where there are no enemy positions. To the left, right, or behind our own positions. The positions are mixed. Some of our positions are in the city, but they only conduct surveillance. They are hiding so that they are not detected by the enemy. Other positions we use to cover for command and communication points. This is where we open fire. This is where the front line is more continuous. But there are cases when somewhere in the neighborhood, or in the neighboring houses, or even in the neighboring entrance, there is the enemy. We control one entrance, and the enemy occupies the other entrance. So we are present in these cities. We control the northern parts of these cities, but this control is not total, only partial.
A few months ago, there was a lot of talk about the so-called encirclement of Myrnohrad. It was understood that it was difficult to talk about total control of these corridors to Myrnohrad, because everything is controlled by drones from both sides. What is going on with these corridors now? Is it still possible to use them for logistics, rotations, or evacuations?
There was never an encirclement of Myrnohrad or Pokrovsk. There was never full control over our logistics or full control of these parts of the territory. North of Myrnohrad, there are Rodinsk and Krasny Liman, settlements that were occasionally captured by the enemy. They were advancing on flanks around the Pokrovsk-Myrnohrad agglomeration. The gray zone, along the entire front line, which now is 10 to 15 kilometers deep, complicates logistics in any sector of the front, not only in Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad. But if we have such an advance on the flanks, then the gray zone from the north and south intersects. And that means that logistics becomes even more complicated. This does not mean that the enemy controls this territory. This does not mean that there is no logistics. But we do it either by air or in bad weather like now. We use ground-based robotic platforms. Or when there is a thick fog or rain, we rotate our troops. But Myrnohrad and Pokrovsk were not encircled for a single day. It's just that, thanks to this advance, the enemy is now gradually pushing us out of our positions, without encirclement.
So, for example, this January we have seen heavy fog. In such weather, could there have been any rotations or ground logistics recently?
Yes, in such weather, the enemy is trying to advance. And we carry out our rotations, send reinforcements, or bring ammunition there.
You talked about this advance on the flanks. Sometimes questions are raised about whether it makes sense to stay there for so long when logistics become so deadly. Roughly speaking, it never looks good on the map when there is not even a complete encirclement, but even a partial one. Can you explain what the point is of maintaining these positions when it looks like it would be possible to level the front on the map?
It all started with the fact that at the tactical level, Pokrovsk was a well-fortified defensive area. It is located on high ground. We controlled the city. There were our weapons, our pilots. And we held it quite powerfully, quite strongly. Then the enemy continued to pressure us, and with the huge losses they suffered, they finally entered Pokrovsk. This happens in war because the enemy outnumbers us in many ways. For example, they outnumber us in the use of tactical aviation. There are glide bombs, there are ballistic attacks, they have very advanced mid-range strikes, for which they sometimes use tactical missiles and so on. And finally, they outnumber us in infantry. In Pokrovsk, the ratio sometimes reached 1 to 8 or 1 to 10. So the enemy ended up in Pokrovsk, and the situation became more difficult for us, much more difficult and even critical in some places. And perhaps this question of why we keep holding Pokrovsk is not for the tactical level commanders. We hold Pokrovsk because we have such an order. This order is given by the leadership at the operational, strategic level. I think you are right that this is related to the strategic and political situation that arises in the negotiation process. Someone in the American offices apparently learned very well how the word Pokrovsk is pronounced. Perhaps this is the only reason we are trying to keep it.
I wanted to ask about the strategic purpose because now it is clear that Pokrovsk was a very solid stronghold, which for a year broke the Russian ambition to push further into Donetsk Oblast toward Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. But now there is a big risk that they are digging in there and creating a foundation for further operations, since they occupied high-rise buildings. How has the strategic significance of Pokrovsk changed over the last few months? And what is it now?
Pokrovsk now has more tactical significance. Neither our side nor the enemy can use it for logistics, because neither the railway nor the roads through Pokrovsk function, and they will not function for a long time. Pokrovsk was important as an entry point to start an offensive further into northern Donetsk Oblast, to the so-called Sloviansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration. But this agglomeration, this large agglomeration in Donetsk Oblast, is in itself a huge fortified area, which the Russians, if they push as they do in Pokrovsk, will storm for 2 years and accordingly suffer huge losses. This is one of the reasons why the Russians constantly demand that we must leave the entire Donetsk Oblast, because only then will we lose this huge fortified area to the north of Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk is no longer a key point of defense. New defensive lines have already been established behind Pokrovsk, and these lines cover the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration.
How would you assess the readiness of these new defensive lines? Because there were questions about this before. In the case of Bakhmut and Avdiivka, there were no prepared lines, but now, on the other hand, fortifications, in the old sense, are losing their function somewhat. How would you assess this now?
Regarding the defensive lines, now there is a lot of aerospace footage of this territory in the public domain. If you look at it, you will see that in the depths of the territory of Ukraine, we have not one, not two, and not 3 prepared defensive lines, which begin with a huge anti-tank ditch, which, in our conditions, perfectly protects us from the movement of the infantry and stops these motorized assaults on motorcycles, on quad bikes. Everything is intertwined with barbed wire. There are anti-tank ditches, hedgehogs, fences, everything is mined. And these lines of defense reach tens of kilometers deep. They have been ready for a long time. That means that there is no operational space where Russians can advance after Pokrovsk. At every meter, they will meet our defenses and will again be trapped while attempting infiltration, suffering huge losses just to advance another meter.
You talked about the ratio of forces being 1 to 8, as I understand it. Is this about the infantry? And is it possible to talk now about the ratio of losses over the months when you were here as a corps?
The ratio of our infantry strength does indeed reach 1 to 8, 1 to 10. The ratio in military equipment is more in our favor, because it is in personnel where we have a huge shortage. But if we talk about artillery strength, for example, then we are practically even with the Russian Federation. Or if we talk about the number of drones or electronic warfare systems, it's the same there. If we talk about the number of vehicles or armored vehicles, Ukrainian troops feel much better in these areas than in the infantry. If we talk about the losses we suffer, the loss ratio is approximately 1 to 6. That is, the Russians lose about 6 times more personnel when on the offensive. And these losses could be even heavier if we could correct our disadvantage in mid-range strike capabilities, in tactical aviation and glide bombs.
When it comes to Russian tactics, and I am especially interested in January, because that's when more attention went to the energy crisis, There was less movement on the front line, as it usually is in winter, but we still see heavy Russian losses. Is it the same infiltration tactics as usual? And is that even possible in these winter conditions? How does winter affect their tactics now?
Winter has increased the number of losses for the Russians because they are forced. They force their soldiers from prepared positions out into the open field, where you have no possibility to dig in, where you don't have a dugout, where you can't warm yourself up, you don't have the opportunity to start a fire. That is, there are also non-combat losses. Soldiers simply lose their will to fight, they freeze, and then, for example, they can be killed by our fire. And this is a big factor. The tactics themselves have not changed. The Russians call this tactic infiltration, this seeping through. This seeping through our positions allows them to gather at some certain spots and overrun. That's what they do. They gradually overrun this area. There are no breakthroughs in our sector. There are no disruptions or major offensive actions. There is just a daily attempt to seep through and overrun the next few square meters.
And if we can give a number, what are the figures for Russian losses in your zone of responsibility for the month of January?
If we only talk about Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad, then the losses that our corps inflicted on the enemy in our sector are about 2,000 servicemen of the Russian Federation who were killed or wounded directly by our forces and fire assets. That is, this trend, in principle, remains more or less constant. Multiply by the number of months, and you get that in half a year we have killed about 12,000 Russians.
The last question I would like to understand, because always after winter comes spring, there is higher activity, there is greenery, better camouflage, infiltration becomes easier. How do you see the prospects of the spring and then summer campaign here on the Pokrovsk axis? What will be the main factors that will determine the course of the battle?
The weather conditions will change for both sides. And if we talk about the fact that our weak point is also logistics, then greenery and good weather will improve logistics for us as well. If we can prepare the kill zone in front of our positions well, and we have prepared it well, then, accordingly, we can look calmly ahead to entering another spring campaign. As hard as it might be to believe, the armed forces are ready to fight for the 5th year.
The Kyiv Independent has big plans for frontline coverage in 2026, even in conditions where it's getting more and more dangerous to get close to the front line and when almost all foreign news organizations have stopped coming entirely. But to do that, to continue doing our work and to make it bigger and better, we do need your support. Please, if you want to help us keep doing what we do, become a member of the Kyiv Independent community by clicking the membership link below. Thank you.